All right, so welcome back to another midweek with Double Creek here at Double Creek Church of Christ. Right now we're in week 27 out of our 52 weeks with Jesus, in that 52 weeks with Jesus book by James Merritt. So 27 weeks, this puts us just past the halfway point. We're starting the second half of these 52 weeks. It's hard to imagine because it goes by pretty fast once you get into it. So this still leaves us in section 4 of this book. As I've mentioned before, section 4 is 12 weeks long. We are in the 9th week of section 4, so after today we have 3 weeks, and then we're going to take a break through December and start back in January. If you remember this story, this section 4, it's called Jesus the Storyteller. So we've been looking at stories, parables told by Jesus. So the title for today's lesson is simply this one: The Object of Our Worship. Now, knowing that this is the title of our lesson for today, knowing that this is a parable that was told by Jesus, which parable do you think we might be looking at today? Well, it just so works out that this parable is the one that we're looking at today, is the parable that I talked about briefly during my sermon on Sunday here at Double Creek Church of Christ. So I won't be going into a lot of great detail about this parable today because we talked a little bit about it Sunday, but Merritt does give us some other ways, other things that we can think, other ways to look at, other things we can think about when it comes to this parable. So today's parable is called the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Some versions, the New American Standard, which I used Sunday, says the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. This version I'm using tonight is the English Standard Version. This parable, it's found in Luke chapter 18, and it's verses 9 through 14. Now, the gist, the main emphasis of this parable is that we need to be careful how we approach God. It's about pride, it's about humility, it's really about the way we think about ourselves. So let's go ahead and read this parable and see what happens. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, as I said, we looked at this parable briefly on Saturday during my sermon, but Merritt does give us some good extra stuff here in this lesson today that we can think about. And one thing he does here in this lesson, as he has done in a few of the other lessons here with Jesus the storyteller in this section, is he gives us a story. Just like Jesus would tell stories to those people then, to the crowds then, for them to understand something, Merritt gives us a story today, placing us in today's time and age to help us understand this a little bit better. And he calls it A Tale of Two Men. And Merritt starts off by talking about a minister. This minister lives in a nice, gated neighborhood, a gated community. Now, if you've ever been to or driven past a gated community, you know that the houses are usually very nice. A gated community. It's a gated community is a collection of homes that I looked up that are accessible only to the residents and their guests. Thanks to, and you know it, thanks to a gate or a wall that is across the roadways that go in or out. So, in a way, they kind of block themselves off from society. Well, in this story that Merritt is telling, a minister lives in one of those gated communities like that. He's got this nice house The windows are beautiful. The entryways to the houses, they're immaculate. The houses are huge. And this minister, he takes time each day to pray to God from this beautiful house. Now, let me say, there's nothing wrong with having a big house. There's nothing wrong with praying inside of a house like this. But this minister, each time he prayed, he would kneel in front of one of those big windows in the front of the house, hoping that the neighbors could see him pray. And he would pray like this. He would say, "Dear God," this minister would say, "I'm so grateful for who I am and what I have. I'm grateful that unlike so many people, I've never had a drink. I've never smoked. I've never used profanity. I've been faithful to my wife and a good father to my children. I am just thankful that I'm not like so many people out there who live lives that are terrible, with terrible lifestyles. And I never will be." So that was his prayer. Set up in a position, just hoping that people would see him praying. But on the other side of town, where the homes are not so nice, maybe the homes are boarded up, maybe they don't even have electricity or heat or air conditioning in the summer. And inside one of these houses is a man who is addicted to drugs. The house stinks. Literally, it smells. There's trash all over the place. This is certainly, no doubt, the type of person who would be looked down on in our society, wouldn't you think so? But this man, this addict, he sits upstairs in front of a coffee table, and there happens to be a line of cocaine right there in front of him. And as he bends over to snort a line of cocaine, he feels a conviction in his heart. And instead of giving in and going through with it, he looks up towards heaven and he says, "Oh God, I am the least worthy person to talk to you. I've made terrible choices in life, and I and my family, we've suffered the consequences. God, please have mercy on me." And so there you have it in this story. Two different houses, two different men, and two totally different prayers, right? And so that would leave us really with this one question. In God's eyes, who do you think got off their knees justified? The person, the minister in the rich house praying, or this addict who realizes he's far gone? And I think the important part of that question that I ask is in God's eyes. Because if we ask that question, who do you think got off their knees justified? If we ask that question in the view of many people, they would say the minister, because of his position in society. And because people may say that the addict, he still has to prove himself. See, we want people to have to prove themselves to us sometimes. And if we think that way, or if people in our society just think that way, then we are thinking like the Pharisee in the parable. You know, I'm thankful that God, to be honest with you, I'm thankful that God does not look at us or think about us in the same way that we may think about other people. Because if God did, we would find ourselves on the outside looking in so often. This is truly a tale of two men. And then Merritt points out the story may be for us. Now, I know it's for us, but we could be in this story. Jesus could replace some of these people with us. And so in this part of the lesson, we really have to start looking deep into ourselves. And that means we have to dig deep, look into who we really are, what our priorities are, and especially, as the title says today, what is our object of worship? Because we can easily, and it happens, we can easily make worship about us, can't we? So think about this. Do we sometimes make worship when we come together on Sunday mornings, or even like we are here at Double Creek for midweek? do we sometimes make it about like what we like to see done? I think the clear answer to that is yes. And I think it's a clear answer just for churches today, especially in America. Because we often do what we want to do to please people. So sometimes we're afraid to do something different because it's not the way we've always done it. We don't want to upset people who have been attending this church or your church for a very long time. And then there are times where we try to change some things and maybe it's not for the best. What I think is important, I think the important thing is that we do whatever needs to be done in our day and time to get people to hear the message of the gospel. Because as we know, that's the first step to becoming a Christian, isn't it? Hearing the gospel. So much of all this church, of church, what we have today, so much of it really comes down to what is our purpose? What is our object of worship? So Jesus tells this parable here in Luke chapter 18. And about two totally different men in similar situations, but with a surprising twist. Now, if you can remember, who would have been part of that crowd there listening to this parable? It would have been the Pharisees. In fact, they were actually the ones in the previous chapter, in Luke chapter 17, who asked Jesus when the kingdom of God would come. So this is still part of that setting. He's talking to them. So in this twist, in the parable, it would have been huge for the Pharisees to hear. Because once again, Jesus is smacking them right in the face with these words. You ever read something from the Bible, or heard someone say something, or heard something during a sermon, or maybe during this section of our 52 weeks with Jesus, and just felt like you were getting smacked in the face? Well, you see, that's kind of what it would have been like for these Pharisees, but on a regular basis. And they kept coming back to hear it. They kept coming back to hear Jesus, not because they agreed with what he said, but because they constantly wanted to trap Jesus. So in this parable, as you know, a parable that puts another twist, on the way that the Pharisees thought. One man was convinced for all the wrong reasons that he was right with God, but he was wrong. The other man, on the other hand, is convinced that for many reasons that he was wrong with God, and he was the one who ends up getting right with God. But remember, this story is about us. It's for us. Merritt then surprisingly tells about how surprisingly, this chapter starts talking about none other than Jeff Foxworthy. Now, if you remember, Jeff Foxworthy, a very famous comedian. He became really famous when he started with those "You Might Be a Redneck If." Now, he was already well known, but "You Might Be a Redneck If" was stuff people used for years and years and years. Well, if we went into Foxworthy mode here with this parable, it could be more like this. You might be in this parable if any of these things are true about us. Do you ever look at people who don't go to church and think you're better than they are because you do go to church? Or do you ever look at people who drink and think that you are better than they are because you don't drink? Or do you ever look at someone who may be living in sexual sin and thank God because you aren't like them? You know, if you do some things like that, we just might be in this parable if we look that way towards others. Now that list could go on and on and on, couldn't it? But I think it really comes down to this. Do we look down on others because we go to church and try to do what's right? And when we look at them and realize they don't, do we look down on them? Because I think it's very easy to do that. Now, if we are thinking that way at times, in any ways with these things like this, Perhaps Jesus is talking to us right now. Perhaps this story may be just for us right now. Merritt points out that, and I've heard this before, but he says, when you look up to God, you'll never look down on others. And on many in this parable, one of them was rejected by God because of what his objective was. The other person was accepted. And it all came down to how they looked at themselves, how they looked at God, how they looked at worship. This is truly a lesson in this parable on pride and humility. And then Merritt points out that we don't bother comparing. Now, if you listened to a Sunday or heard a Sunday sermon, I pointed out that this Pharisee comes along and he's comparing himself to others, and especially this tax collector. I said Sunday, it's like he had this measuring stick, measuring himself up to this tax collector and others. But I said also it was like he brought a resume along with him. You know, what do we use resumes for? I said Sunday we use them when we're applying for a job, and on a resume we try to make ourselves look good. Well, this Pharisee was doing just that. He was talking about how, hey, he's not like all these other people. He fasts twice a week. He tithes of everything he gets, and so on and so on. Everything this Pharisee is saying, he's saying to make himself look good and make the tax collector look bad. So Merritt points out this, that in the very first century, there were 2 services every day in the temple where lambs were sacrificed and an atonement was made for sin. The early service started at sunup. The later service started at 3 o'clock. And each service began outside the sanctuary, at the altar, where the sanctuary for sins would take place, where the sacrifice for sins would take place. Trumpets would sound, cymbals would be clanging, someone would read a psalm, the priest would then enter, he would enter the outer part of this sanctuary area where he would offer the incense and he would trim the lamps. And when he left, then people could offer their prayers to God. So in the first century in Judaism, these Pharisees, they were the cream of the crop. They were at the top. If anybody was okay in the eyes of society, it was the Pharisee. If they could imagine anyone as being right with God, out of everyone else that they knew, everyone else in society, if anyone was right with God, it had to be the Pharisee in the eyes of society. Now, today, what is the mindset that we have towards a Pharisee when we read about them? What do we today, what do people today, what do we, even Christians, think of the first century Pharisee today? Well, typically, it's generally a negative thought for us, but that was not the case some 2,000 years ago. And then Jesus comes along, and he's teaching people that the way that the Pharisees lived, the way they acted, the way they made themselves look, wasn't the right way. But in the first century, if a vote could have been taken, the Pharisee would have been the one voted in as the most righteous, the most holy, the one who was obviously right with God over anyone else. And so the Pharisees in this parable, this Pharisee, he compares himself to others, other people that he thought were beneath him, were lower than him, those extortioners, those unjust people, the adulterers, and certainly but not the least, that tax collector over there. And so this Pharisee, he points out to God that, hey, unlike the rest of those slackers out there, I'm doing even more than I have to. Fasting twice a week, paying more tithes than I really have to, more than others, and so on and so on. And so all this time, he thought it was okay for him to look down on others. And he thought it was okay that for him while he was looking down on others, to still be able to look up to God. Well, Jesus makes it clear in this parable that it doesn't work that way. It was never supposed to work that way. But the Pharisees, they just couldn't help themselves. C.S. Lewis, he's credited with this quote: "A proud man is always looking down on things and people. But as long as you are looking down, you can't see anything that is above you." And if you really think about it, I think that is a very powerful statement. It's one of those strong statements that Jesus was making here during this parable. One of the statements is saying that we cannot look down on others just because we think we are better than them. Maybe we are right with God. Maybe we've taken the steps to become a Christian, a follower of Jesus. But do we sometimes get stuck with the Pharisee mentality? Even if we don't realize it, even if we don't mean to. See, we've got to make sure that we don't bother with comparing ourselves to others around us. Instead, we need to see ourselves correctly. The two men in this parable, they couldn't be more different. They couldn't be more opposite. They are literally like night and day. Totally different. You think of the person seen as the most important in society in our day. And then think of the person who is maybe the least important in our society today. That's kind of what it was like for the Pharisee and the tax collector. This Pharisee was way up here. The tax collector was way down here in terms of authority and power in that society. The temple just really wasn't a place for a tax collector. They weren't really welcome there. And so I hope that we today, I hope we never make church, our congregations, a place where sinners are not welcome, where people who are looked down upon are not welcome. Because we are all sinners saved by the grace of God. If you can remember from our Sign series, a sermon a couple of weeks ago on the U-turn, I said that church is not a place, or it cannot be a place anyway, of people who think they are better than others. Because church is not a place full of people who are better than others. Church is a place full of people who have made that U-turn of life in repentance. And we continue to have to do so day by day and week by week. See, the tax collector in this parable, he stood way back in the distance, off to the side, because he knew what kind of person he was. But this Pharisee, he goes right to the center so he can be seen by all. But it's the tax collector who's seeing himself correctly here. Before we see God correctly, or whenever we can see God correctly, then we can see others, and then we can see ourselves correctly. What this tax collector is ultimately doing, he's making it known that God you already know what I'm like. It's like, God, you know me. But he's also making it known here that he himself knows who he is. He sees himself as a sinner who needs God. And that's what God needs to see and hear from us. Hearts that acknowledge the greatness of God and the weakness of us. God needs us to see ourselves correctly. And when we do, we will see ourselves clearly. One man in this parable saw himself as being innocent, but goes home guilty in the eyes of God. The other man sees himself as being guilty in the eyes of God, but goes home innocent in the eyes of God. You know, it's hard to imagine what the conversations would have been like in the temple the rest of that day. Would the people have realized how selfish, how self-righteous this Pharisee was? Would they have realized how sincere the tax collector was? Or would they still see that Pharisee as the one with the right mind just because of what position he was in? We serve a God who loves us. But we must make God the center of our worship. And when we do that, then we'll be able to see ourselves correctly and see ourselves clearly. So each and every day, we have to ask ourselves, what's the object of our worship? We can't make it about us. We can't make our life about us. You know, each and every day we're making a decision sometimes of what our priority is. On Fridays and Saturdays, are we in worship on those days? And then just thinking, or do we just think, I can do whatever I want Friday and Saturday, and then Sunday morning go to church, and hey, as long as I show up to church, I'm good? Do we sometimes make our weekend such a priority for us because it's our time off from work or whatever for some people, that we go out and do things on the weekend, and then Sunday morning we just don't have enough to give to God? You know, what's the priority? What is the priority that we set in our heart? What is our object of worship? We have to ask ourselves that every single day. I want to thank you for joining us here for our midweek with Double Creek. I hope you've enjoyed it. Focus really on what our object is each and every day. What is our object of worship? God bless and have a great day.